Not a huge basketball fan, but there's a massive rivalry in college basketball between the University of Louisville and the University of Kentucky because every state has two big colleges and they all hate the one that's just like them next door. The story is told that at one of the games between the two schools, an older woman was seen sitting alone with an empty seat next to her. And soon someone approached her and said, "Ma'am, I've rarely seen an empty seat in this arena, let alone a game between these two teams. Can I please ask, whose seat is this?" And immediately, when with great pride, the woman responded that she and her late husband had been season ticket holders for 28 years, and that the seat had belonged to him. "Well," said the man, "couldn't you find a friend or relative tonight to come with you to the game? It's not good for you to be alone, and I'm sure someone would love to be here sitting with you this evening." "Are you kidding me?" the older woman replied. "I'm not alone. God's here with me. The Lord's in this seat beside me. Besides, my friends and family, they're all too busy for me. They're all at my husband's funeral." Everyone has felt kind of abandoned, maybe at one point or another. And sometimes we are. And sometimes we do it to ourselves. Sometimes it's just the rotten way the world seems to have turned out for that circumstance. But it's never really actually completely true. You can't really be abandoned. And she's right. You can't actually ever be alone. There is always someone in that seat next to you. The year was 67 AD. And the Apostle Paul was, in fact, virtually alone. Today, when somebody goes to prison, it's because they've been found guilty of a crime and sentenced to a set period of incarceration to pay their debts to society. But in the first century Roman culture, imprisonment was really just the place that you went to while you were awaiting your trial. Prison was not the punishment. It's just where you went before they decided how best to punish you. For the most part, once your trial was over, your time in prison would be extremely short. After a trial came to completion, you would either be set free, released into slavery in order to pay off debts to the person you owed, forced into the maritime services, or you could be punished by being beaten or perhaps having a body part, like an arm or hand, chopped off. Or you could be executed. The different lengths of time that Paul spends in prison in his life throughout the different books of the Bible generally reflect how geographically far Paul had traveled from a legal Roman judge's seat. Other long imprisonments were likely the result of executive decisions, people who intentionally tried to delay the sentencing of Paul so they could avoid the backlash from his followers. They often did this for popular figures, trying to wait out the revolt. In other words, they might let Paul just rot in prison because they're giving him a sentencing would result in an uprising. So they wait. By the end of 2 Timothy, we know that Paul has finally had at least the first portion of his trial. And by the end of the book, it seems like it's completed. Though 1 and 2 Timothy and the book of Titus were all written to ministers at essentially the same time, we also understand that this was the last time Paul mentions a trial before he's faced it. And while he never explicitly states the exact punishment he knows that he will soon face, I think we get a general tone about how the trial went and what is going to happen any day. It's all just a matter of time, really. His fate was sealed, and Paul knew it. He writes, "For I am already being poured out like a drink offering. And at the time of my departure, it's near. I have fought a good fight. I have finished the race, and I have kept the faith. In short, Paul sees his life as the drink offering that the fathers of his faith used to splash on the side of the altars right after the animal sacrifice and right before it's dedicated to the Lord, just after it would be cut to pieces and burnt. Sometimes the wolves that we fear in life are real. Paul's death was already decided, and in a way, it was underway. Paul knew his death was coming, and he felt so incredibly alone in that prison cell. One odd thing about life, however, is that just how alone we feel is often just a matter of attitude. As the story goes, an organization in conjunction with the state of Montana, somewhere around 1970, offered a bounty of $5,000 for every single wolf you could kill or capture. It was 1976, and two hunters named Sam and Jed Gaffey decided to head for the hills and make some quick money capturing and shooting wolves. Day and night they scoured the mountains and the forest searching for their very valuable prey, but it always seemed like the wolves were just out of reach. And then in the evening, exhausted after 3 days of hunting with no success, they both fell asleep in the tent with a small flap opened just next to an even smaller fire. But during the night, Sam suddenly woke up to find that he and Jed were surrounded by a pack of 30 or so wolves with flaming red eyes and bared teeth, snarling at the two hunters prepared to pounce on a free meal. Sam nudged Jed, who woke up with the immediate look of terror on his eyes, seeing what he did before his face. "Jed, get up," Sam said. "We're going to be rich." And today we know this story because Sam was right. The fact is, sometimes in life when we are surrounded by what appears to be many difficulties, as if it's just us against the world facing impossible odds, we may in fact be surrounded by opportunities and blessings without realizing it. Sometimes when we think of something as a crisis, we can choose to be frightened and run away, or we can stand firm and choose to be courageous. Sometimes it's just a matter of that perspective. Many years ago, American President John F. Kennedy famously and incorrectly popularized the idea that the Chinese word for crisis also means opportunity. And it's a good sentiment that would match this service, but it's not quite correct. The word Kennedy referred to actually means more something akin to a dangerous point of change. Sometimes our worries, our wolves, are very real and very dangerous. Sometimes, not all the time. Sometimes a pack of wolves is really a pack of wolves, and there's no money in it at all. As Paul writes to his trusted protege Timothy, he recalls a list of his friends who left him with no one to speak on his behalf at his trial. Prisons, by the way, didn't feed people. These people who left him, these are the people who would previously have brought him food and clothing, cared for Paul, and were the people who were supposed to speak for him at his trial. But they had almost all abandoned him. Demas had previously been a co-worker of Paul in the church, but fearing that he would be killed and sentenced to death, he left Paul just a few weeks before the trial began, rather than standing for him. Luke, one of Paul's great friends, who would later become the gospel writer Luke, had previously gone on a mission, but when the trial was called before he returned, he realized he couldn't make it back in time for the sentencing anyway, so he stayed. And in case you didn't know, the Gospels were actually written after Paul. Paul's books all come before the four Gospels. They come first in the order of the New Testament, but they were written down last. Mark is not there either. Crestus and Titus have left Paul too for continued ministry. They left 3 months before. They didn't know the trial would come so quick. They thought they'd be waiting. Paul's friend Tychicus was in Ephesus, doing good work. Paul called him his friend, and he checked in on his other, Timothy, because he was in Ephesus as well. These two didn't exactly abandon Paul, but it still wasn't the same thing as having them with him. Mark had split from Paul and Barnabas on the first missionary journey, something that Paul tells us in his books that he's actually very angry about. But then he later comes to terms with it. Interestingly, though, had Paul known that John Mark, the author of Mark's Gospel, was in the process of writing down Peter's remembrances, Paul wouldn't have worried about his absence at all. He'd have been proud. But that's just it. Paul was in prison. He had no idea where Mark was or what he was writing, if he was doing anything at all. Paul was in a dungeon, and all he knew is that Mark left him, and he wasn't there when Paul needed him the most. As Paul sat in that damp, foul, cold cell in Antonia with no personal possessions, he wrote to this old friend Timothy, asking him if he could please bring him a coat. In the text just before what he read, he asks for a coat and a blanket and a few of his favorite books, most likely parchment portions of the Hebrew Bible. In essence, like a person in a hospital getting a day pass to go home for a holiday, Paul just wanted a visit, to see a friendly face, to feel and to just have that one more day where things look normal and you're at home with your loved ones. And so he asks Timothy to bring him books. And then Paul recalls to his beloved friend the name of the only person who has stayed with him near the prison. He says that a man called Alexander is there with him. Well, there's a problem with Alexander, see, because Alexander is a wolf. Alexander began early on as a student of Paul and then fled. But he did come to the trial. Instead of speaking out for the defense, Alexander spoke for the prosecution. And in the end, not a single friend spoke up for Paul at his trial. Some fled, some were missing, and one betrayed him in court. With no one to speak for his defense, one witness running for his life, and a final one turning on him, Paul was doomed before this trial began. It was a sham. He was, in fact, precisely what he said he was, already poured out. His last offering before God would be his own lifeblood. And like Jesus, he too would die deserted by the ones he loved. But in his loneliness, there was also a feeling of completion and support and providence, as if Paul saw those footprints in the sand, as the poem goes. He saw somebody with him and somebody carrying him on. There's an old story from the Swahili Arab and Congo Free State War. It's probably not completely historical so much as it is a parable, but it's also not without grounding. The story goes like this. There was an African king who grew up with a very close friend. The friend had a very annoying habit, a rather lovely habit, maybe, depending on your view. He looked at every situation that ever occurred in his own life or others with both positive or negative things, and always remarked the exact same way. As the story goes, good or bad, the man would always say, "This is good." One day the king and his friend were out hunting on an expedition, and because the king was the king and the friend was the friend would hold and reload and prepare the guns for the king. However, on this particular occasion, it seemed either a mechanical error occurred or the friend actually did something wrong when setting up the rifle. And either way, after taking the gun from his friend, the king fired to see only a puff of smoke and a splash of blood, and then the smell of his own burnt skin. When the king looked down, he saw the mess the gun had left. Where his thumb once was, now air remained. The thumb blown clean off in the backfire. After examining the situation quickly, the friend remarked, as he always did, saying, "And this is good." To which the king replied, "No, no, no, this is not good." And he immediately called for the guards to take his longtime best friend and put him in prison. As it happens, about a year later, the king was hunting in an area where he should have known to stay clear. During the short 2-year war, this particular region was apparently rumored for cannibalism, usually having to do with Congolese taking Swahilis in the war prisoner. The king was captured and taken to the village. Therefore, they tied his hands, stacked some wood, and set up a stake and bound him to the stake. But as they came near to set fire to the wood, they noticed the king was missing a thumb. And being superstitious about such things, they would never eat or sacrifice anyone who wasn't whole. And so, untying the king, they took his clothes away, but then sent him away on his own. As he returned home, the king was reminded of the events that had taken that thumb, and he felt remorse for his treatment of his friends. And he went right away to the jail to speak, and he said, "You were right, and I'm sorry. It actually was good that thy thumb was taken." And he proceeded to tell his friend all that had transpired. "And so," the king said, "I'm very sorry for sending you to prison and for so long. It was bad for me to do this." "No," his friend replied, "this is good." And again the king yelled in anger, "What do you mean this is good? How could it be good that I sentenced my best friend to jail for over a year?" "If I had not been in jail," said the friend, "I would have been with you, and I'd be dead instead of here with you right now. This is good." In a very unusual way, the message here unfolds. You can choose to see life as a seemingly random grouping of events, or you can choose to see a purpose behind what seems like adversity at the time. And you don't know which it is. Perhaps this is good. I'm sure that if any of us care to reflect on the tragedies, the headaches, the bad times in our life, that we too will discover that we have really grown or developed during that period of time. That even through the reflection which seems to cause discomfort, even though it's there, sometimes it grants strength. It is in this way that we slowly gather experience, we gain wisdom. And even though we may think or feel that it's unfair, at least in some small way, no matter what it was, this is good. For Paul, his last offering was already being poured out. He was going to die. There was, of course, no way this could be good. Death is so final. It was the end, and he was alone. Or was he? Paul writes, "At my defense, no one came to my support, but everyone instead deserted me. But may it not be held against them, Lord. For the Lord stood by my side and gave me strength." The Apostle Paul. For the Apostle Paul, the world was full of wolves. And at times those wolves turned out to be opportunities, and at other times, obstacles to overcome, things to learn from. At other times, at this time, those wolves turned out to be very, very real. But in all things, Paul never lost sight of the providence of God. He fought the good fight. He won the crown. Through the good times and the bad, the seat next to him was never empty. And the truth is, the seat next to you will never be empty either. Because no matter what, you can never be alone. Amen.